All right, get ready to have your minds blown today because we are diving deep into a world you might not expect. Napoleon and his impact on America.
Napoleon and America.
Yeah,
Huh. He never even set foot here.
never.
But he played a huge role in making the U.S. what it is today. It's kind of crazy when you think about it.
It really is. And to help us unpack all of this, we've got the perfect person, historical fiction author Shannon Celine.
Oh, I know her work. Her book, Napoleon in America, is a wild ride.
It is. It basically asks, what if Napoleon had escaped to the U.S. instead of,
Dying in exile.
Exactly.
It's such a clever way to look at history. Like, what if things had gone differently? Plus, with that new Ridley Scott movie coming out, with Joaquin Phoenix as Napoleon,
I talk about perfect timing.
like everything's aligning.
Okay, so let's get into it. How did Napoleon, a guy who never even saw America, end up shaping it?
Well, you got to start with the French Revolution. This wasn't just some regime change. It was like society getting flipped on its head, the old feudal system gone. And from that, this idea of a modern nation state emerges. Sound familiar?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, America had just gone through its own revolution, so that idea of a nation state would have resonated.
Big time. And from all this chaos, out pops Napoleon. Brilliant military mind, total master of propaganda.
Kind of like politics today when you think about it.
Totally. Napoleon knew how to craft an image, how to use it to grab power. But here's the thing. He wasn't just about conquering. This guy was organized. He knew how to consolidate power, build systems. It's like he laid the groundwork for how governments work today, in a way.
Wow, that's mind-blowing. And speaking of shaping governments, we got to talk about the Louisiana Purchase. This deal, it doubled the size of the U.S., 828,000 square miles. Imagine America without that land. No Montana, Wyoming, Colorado.
Crazy, right? But initially, Napoleon, he didn't want to sell, not one bit.
Really? Why not?
He had this vision, this grand plan to rebuild France's empire in America, Louisiana. That was going to be the supply hub for his Caribbean sugar colonies.
Ah, so it was all about strategy.
Totally.
Yeah.
But then, Haiti happened.
Haiti.
Yeah. Napoleon tried to regain control there, but it was a disaster. Fierce resistance. Then yellow fever ripped through his troops. It was brutal.
So what did he do?
He needed cash, right? Wars in Europe were expensive. Plus, he couldn't risk the British just swooping in and taking Louisiana. So bam, he sells it to the U.S. $15 million.
A steal. I mean, you can't even buy a decent house in some cities for that much these days.
And it shows how much Napoleon underestimated America. He was so focused on Europe, he missed this chance to have a real foothold in North America. And get this, he wasn't even a fan of how America did things.
Oh, tell me more.
So yeah, Napoleon led a constitutional republic. But deep down, he thought republics were weak, unstable. America's system with its changing leaders, its citizen army. He thought it was flawed, compared to his vision of a strong, centralized state.
I remember reading somewhere he called America a nation of merchants.
Oh yeah. All about money, he thought. A fundamental weakness, according to him. He was all about strong leadership, a unified government.
It's funny because that clashes so hard with classic American ideals. Individual freedom, limited government, all that.
And it caused some tension, even back then, with guys like Jefferson and Madison.
I can imagine.
At first, they were hopeful about Napoleon.
Uh-huh.
Another republic, right? But then he declares himself emperor. They saw it as a betrayal. All those principles of the American Revolution just tossed aside.
It's a debate that still goes on today, isn't it?
Totally. How much power should the government have? Freedom versus security. It's like we're still wrestling with the same questions that Napoleon's rise brought up.
And speaking of power struggles, this leads us right into another big point, the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, and how they pulled America into its own war, the War of 1812.
I bet I can already guess how this ties back to Napoleon, even though he was across the ocean. You probably can. See, Napoleon, he had this thing called the Continental System, basically an economic war on Britain, block all trade.
And that affected America.
Oh yeah. Britain retaliated with blockades of its own. American ships were trapped in the middle. Both sides were seizing ships, forcing American sailors into their navies. What a mess.
So what did America do?
Well, Jefferson tried something bold. The Embargo Act of 1807.
Oh, yeah, I remember that from history class.
He figured, cut off trade with both Britain and France, force them to respect America's neutrality.
Did it work?
Not even close. It backfired spectacularly. The American economy tanked, hurt farmers, merchants. Everyone was furious.
Classic unintended consequences.
The worst. And this whole thing just added fuel to the fire between America and Britain, which, you guessed it, led to the War of 1812.
So it's like America got its own version of the Napoleonic Wars, even though it was fought on a different continent.
Exactly. And it shows how connected the world was becoming. What happened in Europe had a real impact on Americans, their politics, their economy. It shaped their future.
But let's step back a second. How did regular Americans even experience all this? Napoleon was making waves over there, but how did news travel back then?
I imagine it was a lot slower than today. Letters, word of mouth, maybe a few newspapers. It must have been a totally different world.
It was. People relied on traveler stories, bits and pieces from newspapers, letters from abroad. It was like piecing together a puzzle.
I bet Napoleon's image, his victories, his growing empire, it must have been a mix of fascination and maybe a little fear given his, increasingly authoritarian
Oh,
tendencies.
for sure. And then you have figures like James Monroe, America's minister to France.
Yeah.
Total Francophile. Spoke French fluently, loved the culture.
He had a front row seat to everything going on in France. He did. He negotiated the Louisiana Purchase with Napoleon himself. Even saw him crowned emperor. Those experiences would have shaped his views on Napoleon and influenced how America saw Napoleonic France. It was a time when personal relationships really mattered in international relations. And that brings us to a fascinating twist in the story. The arrival of Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, in the United States.
Oh, this is where it gets interesting. So, while Napoleon was considering escaping to America after his defeat at Waterloo,
He actually rejected the idea.
really,
He thought it was beneath him. Couldn't imagine hiding out in a country he saw as inferior to his grand vision of France.
too proud, huh? So the great Napoleon wouldn't stoop to seeking refuge in America.
Seems that way. But his brother, Joseph, he had no such qualms. After Napoleon's fall, he fled to the United States and settled right in.
Wait, so Napoleon's stressing about his image and his brother's off living the American dream. That's incredible. Tell me, how did Joseph blend in? Was he living a quiet life, trying to stay under the radar?
Not exactly. He had managed to move a good chunk of his fortune to the U.S. So he wasn't exactly roughing it. He bought this massive estate, Point Breeze,
Yeah.
near Bordentown, New Jersey.
Point Breeze.
Yeah.
How massive are we talking?
1,800 acres with a mansion. They said it was second only to the White House back then in grandeur.
Wow. Okay, so not exactly blending in.
Well, he also had this incredible art collection.
And people just accepted him. Napoleon's brother.
It's funny, the U.S. government, they were a bit cautious, didn't want to upset France,
Mm.
but regular Americans,
Mm-hmm.
they were fascinated by Joseph. I mean, think about it. This guy was king of Spain, close to Napoleon, and now he's just living in New Jersey.
I guess everyone loves a good story, especially one with royalty. But did he do anything besides throw fancy parties?
Oh, he did more than party. Remember that library I mentioned?
One bigger than the Library of Congress.
That one. 8,000 volumes. And that art collection, he shared it. Places like the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts got to display his pieces.
So he was kind of like a cultural bridge between Europe and America.
Yeah, you could say that. He brought European art and knowledge to America, especially in Philly. It makes you wonder how American art might be different today without him.
It's crazy how these little things can have such a big impact. What about regular French people who immigrated here back then? Were they all running from Napoleon?
It was a mix, really. You had Haitian refugees escaping the revolution there. Some folks opposed Napoleon's rule, and some, they were just looking for a better life.
The American dream, right?
The American dream. It's always been a powerful thing.
Mm.
But it wasn't always easy for those immigrants, was it? I mean, starting over in a new country.
It was tough. Some did well, integrated. Others, they faced prejudice, struggled. You know, the vine and olive colony in Alabama.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
That's a good example of how the dream didn't always work out. And then you have guys like General Charles Lalemant, tried to carve out a bit of France in the New World.
He did where?
Texas. Led an expedition there, but it fizzled out. But these stories, they show how Napoleon's influence, even indirectly, pushed people to try new things, take chances. It's like Napoleon cast a shadow across the ocean, even if he never set foot here. We've talked about his impact on America, but we can't forget Latin America. Napoleon had a huge role in shaping that part of the world too, even if it was unintentional.
Totally. And it all goes back to, remember when Napoleon invaded Spain, put his brother on the throne there?
Yeah, Joseph.
Right. Well, that one action, it sparked revolutions all over Latin America.
Wait, so Napoleon, who never even went to Latin America, caused revolutions there. How?
Well, Spain was in chaos, weakened.
Hmm.
So the Latin American colonies, they saw their chance. They didn't recognize Joseph as their king, so bam, they declared independence.
That's wild. And of course, this had a big impact on the U.S. too.
Absolutely. All these new nations popping up in Latin America, it created all sorts of opportunities for the U.S. economically, politically, and in the end, it helped make the U.S. the major power in the Western Hemisphere.
It's amazing how Napoleon, sitting over there in Europe, focused on his own ambitions, could have such a huge impact on the Americas. It's like he accidentally reshaped the entire map.
It's like those dominoes, you know. You knock one over, and it sets off a whole chain reaction. You can't always predict what's going to happen.
History is full of surprises like that. But beyond all the big events, the wars, the revolutions, it's important to remember the people, their stories, their hopes and dreams.
Absolutely. And Shannon Saline, her book gives us a peek into those lives, reminds us that history isn't just about dates and battles, it's about real people living through crazy times.
And their choices, their actions, those have consequences. Sometimes those consequences ripple out further than anyone could imagine. Like Napoleon, what if he had actually escaped to America? How would that have changed things?
Those what ifs are what make history so fascinating. It's not just a story from the past, it's a story that's still unfolding. We're all part of it.
And that's a good reminder that history isn't just something we learn about in books, it's something we're all living and creating every day.
But let's not get too lost in those what ifs. Let's bring it back to Joseph Bonaparte. Remember him? Napoleon's brother.
The one who embraced America.
That's the one. While Napoleon turned his nose up at the idea of escaping here, Joseph built a life for himself. A really interesting life.
So Napoleon's too good for America, but his brother's living it up in a mansion. That's wild. Okay, so tell me more about Joseph's life here. Did he really blend in, or was it just, fancy parties and showing off his riches?
Well, he wasn't exactly hiding. Remember, he escaped with a lot of money.
Right, that whole fortune thing. So what did he do with it all?
He bought an estate. Point Breeze, they called it. It was near Bordentown, New Jersey.
Point Breeze. Okay. How grand are we talking?
It was huge, 1,800 acres. And the mansion. People said it was second only to the White House itself back then.
Wow. So much for blending in, huh? I'm still stuck on this. People just accepted him. Like, oh, hey, it's Napoleon's brother. Welcome to the neighborhood.
It's funny. The U.S. government, yeah, they were a bit cautious, didn't want to ruffle feathers in France. But regular Americans, they ate it up. This guy was king of Spain, for crying out loud. He knew Napoleon personally. They couldn't get enough of him.
I guess a good story never gets old, especially if it involves European royalty. But okay, so he had money, he had stories. But did Joseph actually do anything worthwhile in America? Or was it just parties and extravagance?
No, he was more than just a party guy.
Yeah.
Remember that huge library he brought?
The one that was bigger than the Library of Congress at the time?
That's the one. 8,000 books. And that art collection, he didn't keep it all to himself. He lent pieces to places like the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts.
Oh, wow. So he was like this accidental art ambassador bringing European culture to America.
In a way, yeah. Especially in Philadelphia. He had a big impact on the art scene there. It makes you think, how different would American art be today without him?
It's those little ripples, those unexpected connections that make history so fascinating. Speaking of connections, all those French people who immigrated during this time, it wasn't just about escaping Napoleon, right? What were their stories?
It was a whole mix of reasons. You had Haitian refugees fleeing the revolution. You had folks who were against Napoleon's rule. And then, of course, you had people just seeking a better life. The classic American dream.
Always a powerful draw. But I imagine starting over in a new country, especially back then, it must have been incredibly tough for some.
It wasn't easy for everyone. Some adjusted, integrated. Others faced prejudice, struggled to fit in. That vine and olive colony in Alabama, it's a reminder that the dream wasn't always a reality.
That's a good point. Success wasn't guaranteed, even if you were escaping a difficult situation. And then there were those who tried to recreate a little piece of France here, like General Lalemant in Texas.
Lalemant. Led that expedition to Texas, tried to create a French outpost, but it didn't pan out. These stories, they show how Napoleon's influence, even indirectly, made people take risks, seek new beginnings. It's really remarkable.
It is. Napoleon's reach was so much greater than just Europe.
And speaking of reach, we have to circle back to Latin America. Napoleon never went there, but he played a huge role in shaping that part of the world too, even if he didn't mean to.
Yeah. It's a classic example of unintended consequences. Remember Napoleon's invasion of Spain, putting his brother, Joseph, on the throne.
I'm seeing where this is going.
Well, that one event set off revolutions across Latin America.
Wait, so Napoleon, who never even set foot in Latin America, caused revolutions there? How did that happen?
Spain was in chaos. Remember, they were weak. And the Latin American colonies, they saw a chance to break free. They didn't recognize Joseph as their king, and so they declared independence.
Wow, that is wild. It's like a domino effect. One thing leads to another, and suddenly the whole map is changing. And of course, this all had major implications for the United States.
Absolutely. All those new nations in Latin America created opportunities for the U.S., economically and politically. And in the end, it helped make the U.S. the dominant force in the Western Hemisphere, which is still true today. It's mind-blowing to think that Napoleon, sitting over in Europe, obsessed with his own goals, could accidentally shape the Americas so profoundly. He truly had a global impact.
It's a reminder that history is full of those unexpected turns. It's messy, it's complicated, and sometimes the biggest changes come from events no one could have predicted.
It's a good thing to remember, especially today when everything feels so uncertain. What are some of the key takeaways you hope our listeners will keep in mind?
I think the biggest one is this. History is about people, their stories, their choices. It's not just about dates and wars, and those choices, they have consequences. Sometimes those consequences reach farther than we can even imagine.
It's like a ripple effect spreading outward.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that we're all part of this story. We're all making choices, shaping history in our own ways.
That's a powerful thought. It makes you realize how connected we all are across time and continents.
And for anyone who wants to dive deeper into this era, I can't recommend Shannon Celine's book, Napoleon in America, enough. It's a fantastic read, full of those what-if moments that make history so intriguing.
It really makes you think about how different things could have been.
Well, on that note, I want to thank everyone for joining us on this deep dive into Napoleon and his unexpected impact on America. It's been a fascinating journey through history, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. Until next time.